It started like any other Tuesday, warm air, quiet streets until a single injustice cracked the silence wide open. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning had a stillness to it, the kind that belongs only to a southern summer day before the heat takes full control. Atlanta shimmered in golden light. Storefronts dusted off their sidewalks, coffee brewed behind tall glass windows, and somewhere on Auburn Avenue, a gospel hum drifted from a passing car radio. It was a day too clean, too quiet, the kind where no one expected anything out of the ordinary. But trouble doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't knock, it just walks in. Nestled on the corner of a newly gentrified block, stood Darren Maddox's high-end restaurant, Maddox and Pine. The white awnings fluttered lightly. Outside, a valet opened doors for customers who pulled up in black Escalades and Teslas, nodding with practiced politeness. The sidewalk smelled like lavender polish and fresh citrus. Inside, jazz murmured beneath clinks of glassware. The air was expensive and exclusive. This was no place for mistakes or memories. And yet, at exactly 10:42 a.m., a woman stepped through those tall glass doors, her steps both deliberate and uncertain. Her name was Evelyn Maddox, and though time had etched lines around her eyes, there was a quiet dignity in the way she held her chin. Her hands, worn from years of cleaning homes and raising children without help, clutched a modest black purse. She wore a dress that was once Sunday's best, now made ordinary by repetition and age. She wasn't there to make a scene. She came only to see her son. The hostess barely looked up. She was young, maybe 23, with dyed blonde hair and an iPad in her hands. She glanced at Evelyn's shoes first, then her dress, then her face. A pause, the kind that says more than words. A pause that freezes a woman mid-step and slices through her confidence like glass. "Do you have a reservation?" the hostess asked, in that tone. Polite, practiced, but hollow. Evelyn smiled softly, one hand still clutching her purse. "No, I just came to see someone, my son, Darren." The girl blinked. Chef Darren doesn't usually take visitors, especially not during prep hours. There was no warmth in her voice, no recognition in her face. She didn't know Evelyn, and more importantly, she didn't want to. Evelyn nodded slowly, unsure whether to press forward or retreat. But before she could speak again, another hostess appeared, whispering something into the first girl's ear. There were sideways glances, eye rolls, quiet laughter. And just like that, Evelyn was asked, kindly of course, to leave. Across the street, Shaquille O'Neal sat in the back seat of a black town car with the window cracked just enough to catch a breeze. Dressed in simple black slacks and a loose white shirt, Shaq had spent most of his morning at a community school a few blocks away. No cameras, no announcements. That was his way. He preferred quiet impact, a thankless kind. He'd promised his mother he'd never forget where he came from, and he never had. Today he was back in Atlanta under the radar, checking in on a few investments and taking care of business that didn't need the spotlight. He hadn't meant to stop, but something made him linger outside Maddox and Pine. Maybe it was the soft regret in Evelyn's face, or the way her hands trembled as she walked back down those steps, rejected not just as a customer, but as a mother. Something in her eyes reminded him of Lucille, his own mother. The kind of woman who'd go without meals just to feed her child. The kind of woman the world was too quick to forget the moment that child made it. He watched her pause at the corner bus stop bench. Her purse now rested in her lap like a secret she wished she hadn't carried. She didn't cry. She just sat still. In a city that claimed to be forward, she'd just been pushed back in time. Shaq leaned forward and told his driver to wait. Inside the restaurant, laughter resumed. Servers moved between tables, prepping for lunch rush. In the back, Darren Maddox was plating a private dish for a food critic from Chicago. He didn't know his mother had come by, or maybe he did. The line between forgetting and pretending can be thin, especially when success whispers in your ear that your past is best left behind. He was surrounded by white investors, white sommeliers, and white customers who praised his refined southern palate. The irony was cruel. Evelyn remained on that bench for nearly 8 minutes. People passed her, none stopping, none seeing her. Just another old black woman sitting alone in a fancy part of town. But Shaq saw. And Shaq didn't forget. Those 8 minutes would stretch into a reckoning none of them saw coming. Not the hostess, not the waitstaff, not even Darren Maddox himself. Because when a man like Big Shaq sees injustice, especially the kind that's been sugar-coated in civility, he doesn't tweet about it. He doesn't rage. He acts, quietly, thoroughly. The restaurant didn't know it yet, but its clock had started ticking. And every tick was leading towards something irreversible. What happened next wouldn't involve fists or shouting matches. It wouldn't make the evening news for a brawl or broken glass. No, it would be cleaner than that. Colder. More permanent. Because what they didn't realize was this. When Evelyn Maddox walked out of that restaurant, they hadn't just turned away a mother. They'd turned away the very soil their success was rooted in. And Big Shaq? He just watched the whole thing unfold. By the time Evelyn rose from that bench, Shaq had already made his decision. And once Shaq decides, things change. Permanently. Blood ties mean nothing when pride feeds the ego more than love. In the back kitchen of Maddox and Pine, the stainless steel surfaces reflected ambition, not heritage. Everything was polished. The appliances, the plating, the brand. Overhead, the lights cast long, sterile lines across the counter where Darren Maddox stood, arranging a small forest of microgreens over a scallop plate. His movements were swift, exacting, confident, like he had trained not just to cook, but to erase hesitation. The staff around him obeyed his gestures more than his words. They knew his rhythm, not his roots. This wasn't just a kitchen. It was a theater of reputation. On the far wall, a large photo mural showed Darren standing with a group of food critics at a culinary award gala. His smile wide, his suit crisp, his company pale-skinned and powdered in magazine glamour. No mention of who raised him. No mention of where he came from. Just words like visionary, refined, Southern elegance redefined. But the real story of Darren Maddox began far from this polished concrete and boutique linen. It began in a two-bedroom apartment in the heart of a working-class black neighborhood, where grease stains on the stove meant dinner was happening, and silence between meals meant bills were being juggled behind closed doors. That story lived in flashbacks, unspoken and sharp, unrolling quietly in the spaces between his choices. A young Evelyn, bone-tired but upright, kneeling in front of a busted washing machine, scrubbing Darren's uniform shirt with a bar of soap and a metal brush. Evelyn, frying eggs on a single working burner, giving Darren the larger portion and claiming she'd already eaten. Evelyn walking in rain to a second job while Darren slept on the couch with a notebook full of culinary sketches and recipes cut out of magazines. Evelyn, pressing her last $50 into his palm, the night before he left for New York to chase a scholarship that came without a return ticket. She never asked for credit. She only asked for time, a visit, a call, a place at the table. But somewhere between food festivals and feature spreads, Darren stopped returning her calls, stopped introducing her at events. She was too raw, too real. She didn't match the polished image his publicist was building, the brand that promised soul food sophistication, without the burden of blackness that white investors flinched at. In his world now, blackness was a spice, not the soil. His name had been elevated, printed, trademarked. But Evelyn's name? It was nowhere. Not on the menu, not in interviews, not in the fine print of press releases. It was like she'd been dusted off his history the same way one wipes crumbs from a counter, quietly, casually, permanently. In a conference room 2 floors above the dining space, Darren reviewed his expansion pitch with a team of legal consultants and PR strategists. A new flagship location in Chicago, talks with a streaming platform for a cooking series, a possible cookbook ghostwritten by a lifestyle editor. He was wearing custom Italian loafers and a hand-stitched suit. His watch cost more than Evelyn's entire yearly income. His success was a crescendo, but the cost had been silence. And right beneath that silence, a slow reckoning was waiting. Because what Darren didn't know, what no one in that restaurant knew, was that Shaquille O'Neal had already stepped through their front door. Not as a celebrity, not as a customer, not as someone to pose with for a brand photo. He walked in quietly, nodded once at the manager who nervously recognized him, and moved with purpose toward the private mezzanine room, where high-value stakeholders met. There were no greetings, no fanfare. Shaq's presence said enough. In the investor's ledger, he was listed only as S. O'Neal Holdings LLC, a quiet backer who'd fronted early funding during Darren's expansion talks when no one else believed a black chef could cross into the luxury market without watering down his identity. At the time, Shaq had believed in Darren's potential, not because he liked trendy food, but because he knew what it meant for young black boys to be told they belonged in sports or rap, but not in fine dining. But that belief had been stretched thin over time, and today it snapped. Shaq hadn't come to discuss money. He came because he'd watched Darren's mother get dismissed like a nobody in the place she should have been honored. And the cruelty of it, Darren didn't even know it had happened. Or worse, he did know and didn't care. As Shaq sat at the table, the staff scrambled to adjust. A special espresso was rushed up. A junior partner arrived with the latest quarterly reports. They wanted to talk numbers, growth, market share, but Shaq wasn't interested in spreadsheets. His silence filled the room like a tide. Downstairs, Chelsea laughed as she scrolled through her phone. She was texting another hostess about the old lady who showed up claiming she knew the chef. They found it hilarious, how people always tried to finesse their way in with fake stories. Probably someone he fired from housekeeping, one message read. No one questioned it. No one corrected it. Even now, the idea of a black woman connected to a place like this still felt like an interruption. Outside, Evelyn stood from the bench. The bus hadn't come, but she couldn't sit there forever. Her knees ached. The sun was beginning to sting through the light denim on her arms. She walked slowly past the restaurant again, this time not looking through the glass, not hoping, just moving. And Shaq? He watched her from the upstairs window, expression unreadable, heart anchored. He knew that walk. He'd seen it in his mother. That walk that says, I don't need to be invited in, but you'll regret leaving me out. Shaq's phone buzzed. It was a message from an old colleague who used to coach with him on a youth mentorship program. You still working with that Darren Maddox kid? Why? He told some kids on a podcast last week that he doesn't really relate to the struggle thing anymore. Said it's all about vision now. Thought that was your guy. Shaq closed the phone and placed it face down. The mezzanine room was too quiet. He stood. You'll get the call in an hour, Shaq told the startled project lead. This conversation's done. We'll be restructuring, immediately. But Mr. O'Neill, one of them stammered. With all due respect. Shaq turned his head slowly, and the room fell silent. There was no yelling, no drama, just a weight that said the clock had run out. The door closed behind him, and the echo of that silence rolled down the marble stairs like a warning. Because blood may not be listed in the contracts. But for Shaq, loyalty to your roots was the only investment that mattered. And Darren, he'd just defaulted. Sometimes silence is the loudest scream, and in those 8 minutes Shaq said everything without a single word. The sun had shifted slightly now, painting the city in warmer golds and deeper shadows. The glass facade of Maddox and Pine shimmered with light, but inside the atmosphere was changing. Something subtle, electric, just below the surface. No alarms, no shouting, but a shift, the kind of pressure that builds when justice sits too long without being served. Shaquille O'Neal had taken a seat in the far corner of the main dining area, not at the bar, not in the private mezzanine where investors hid behind suits, but at a small round table usually reserved for overlooked reservations and last-minute brunchers. He didn't speak to the server, didn't order. He simply sat, elbows resting on the edge of the linen-draped table, his wide frame motionless, eyes sharp. His silence was intentional, surgical, the kind of silence that makes people nervous without knowing why. A water glass sweated in front of him, untouched. Across the street, Evelyn remained seated at the bus stop. She hadn't moved. The wind had picked up just enough to lift the corner of her coat. Her back was straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap, holding onto that little purse like it still contained a reason to wait. She wasn't crying. She didn't fidget or check her phone. She simply existed, uninvited and unbothered, though something in her still waited, not for a ride but for a recognition that would never come. The restaurant buzzed on in its usual rhythm. Plates clinked, forks tapped. The kitchen shouted in rhythms of urgency. Waiters passed each other like dancers in a too-tight ballet, calling out table numbers and substitutions. And somewhere near the service station, a group of staff clustered behind a partition, laughing low and smug about that weird old woman. Chelsea mimicked Evelyn's soft-spoken tone, imitating how she'd asked for her son like she was confused or delusional. Another waiter, Jesse, added, "Man, I thought she was gonna pull out some flyer and say she's his long-lost auntie." Laughter followed. A busboy shook his head and said, "If she shows up again, I'm not answering the door, straight up." None of them noticed Shaq watching them. None of them cared that he was still sitting in the corner with the same glass of water, and a stillness that had begun to disturb even the newer hires who couldn't tell if he was waiting for a meal, a meeting, or something else entirely. In the kitchen, Darren Maddox had just finished plating a smoked halibut with truffle-laced aioli. He wasn't in a rush. He was joking with the sous chef about booking a private table at the Hamlin in Chicago next week. He had his phone tucked under his apron, checking social media between orders, watching his follower count inch past 2.1 million. He was in his element, all charm and control, until one of the hostesses came back and whispered, "Hey, Big Shaq's here, sitting alone, not talking." Darren didn't react at first. He chuckled. "Shaq? Seriously? Why didn't anyone tell me earlier? I'll go say what's up." But when he stepped out of the kitchen and scanned the room, something about Shaq's posture made him stop. The smile faltered. The lightness shifted. Shaq wasn't smiling, wasn't meeting eyes, wasn't holding court like a visiting celebrity. He was studying, listening, waiting. Darren turned back toward the kitchen, uncertain for the first time that morning. Upstairs, In the office that served as the administrative nerve center, the manager Kyle Braddock, a man who prided himself on knowing trends before they hit TikTok, was reviewing monthly projections. He'd gotten a text minutes earlier from one of the servers. "Shaq's here. Something's weird." Kyle had been in this industry long enough to know when a visit wasn't just a visit. He'd seen this happen before. Investors showing up unannounced, watching more than tasting, observing more than interacting. It meant something was coming. Something big. Back at his table, Shaq checked his watch. It had now been exactly 8 minutes since Evelyn had been turned away. 8 full minutes of laughter, arrogance, and indifference. 8 minutes where a mother had been reduced to a punchline in a restaurant her own blood had built. 8 minutes where not a single person had come looking for her. 8 minutes of knowing, not suspecting, not guessing, but knowing what had happened and how intentional it was. Shaq stood. He didn't ask to be taken anywhere. He didn't speak to a waiter. He walked through the restaurant with calm purpose, each step deliberate and unnerving. Guests turned as he passed, some whispering, others pulling out phones, but Shaq didn't flinch. His size wasn't what made people part for him. It was the energy. The storm was coming, and no one knew where it would land. He headed straight for the manager's office. Kyle looked up just as the door opened. "Mr. O'Neill," he said, half standing, voice nervous but trying to stay professional. "Wasn't expecting." Shaq closed the door behind him. The latch clicked with a finality that settled over the room like a thick fog. Downstairs, the staff continued as normal, but a few began to whisper about where Shaq had gone. Chelsea was trying to reapply her lipstick in the reflection of a tray when one of the bartenders asked, "You think it's about that lady from earlier?" "What lady?" she replied, eyes still on her lips. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. In the kitchen, Darren had returned to the pass, barking orders with a little more edge now. He didn't say it out loud, but his eyes flicked toward the manager's hallway again and again, each time with a little more tension. The minutes stretched. 8 had passed. Then 10. Then 11. What was said in that room between Shaq and Kyle would never be recorded, never printed, never leaked. But by the time Shaq stepped out, his shoulders square, his expression unchanged, the air in the building had shifted entirely. Like a new pressure system had moved in, and no one could quite name it yet. Shaq walked past the servers, past the bar, past Darren, who caught a glimpse of him, and nodded, a weak, uncertain gesture, more question than greeting. Shaq didn't return it. He exited the restaurant, pausing only once at the glass door to look across the street. Evelyn was gone. The bench sat empty. Shaq stood still for just a moment longer, his reflection caught in the glass as patrons behind him laughed, sipped wine, and continued their meals like nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The clock had started, and nobody inside had heard it. No one recognized her face, but someone should have. Someone who once called her mama. The hostess stand gleamed with brushed brass. It stood like a miniature podium, a gatekeeper's altar, in a space carved for the polished and privileged. Evelyn approached it cautiously, her steps firm yet conscious of the eyes already sweeping over her from behind designer menus and wine glasses. She didn't fit the aesthetic, not in her church-worn shoes, not in the soft denim coat she'd mended herself 3 winters ago, not in her skin, aged and black, too familiar to be celebrated. Behind the stand stood Chelsea, the head hostess, a young woman who'd been trained to smile with her teeth but never her eyes. She didn't lift her gaze immediately. Instead, her manicured fingers slid across the iPad, checking brunch RSVPs, noting allergies and birthdays. When she finally glanced up, it was quick, almost dismissive, the kind of look that flinched away as if acknowledging Evelyn for too long might invite discomfort. "Yes?" she asked, her voice clipped. "I'm here to see Darren," Evelyn said gently, not assuming she'd be recognized, but hoping she'd be heard. Her words held no arrogance, just the weathered tremor of someone who'd waited too long to say them out loud. Chelsea's brows knit in confusion. Then came the pause, not long but sharp, a pause that measured Evelyn's presence, and found it lacking. "Do you have an appointment?"
"No, sweetheart. I just wanted to surprise him."
Chelsea's polite smile vanished. She tucked a strand of platinum blonde hair behind her ear, and gave Evelyn a more deliberate glance, the kind used to assess whether a woman belonged or needed to be quietly handled. "Chef Darren doesn't usually do surprises, especially during lunch prep. I can leave him a note?" Evelyn hesitated. Her hands gripped the edge of her purse a little tighter. She didn't know what to say. Would Darren be mad? Would he even come out? Her heart tugged with the weight of too many years apart. And yet, in her silence, Chelsea found her opportunity. "I'm sorry, ma'am. If you'd like to make a reservation, we're currently booked until Friday. Maybe check online?" There it was, the full dismissal, sugar-coated with hospitality. The way some restaurants sweep dignity under marble tiles without leaving a trace. Evelyn nodded once, her mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no words came. She turned away, her spine still straight, her silence loud. Behind her, Chelsea muttered something under her breath. A male waiter nearby chuckled. Another hostess smirked as she pulled out the reservation list. Not one of them asked if Evelyn needed help. Not one bothered to ask who she was. Not even when she stopped, just for a second, at the base of the steps and looked back, not with pleading, but with a question only one person in that building could answer. That person was in the kitchen. Darren Maddox, chef, owner, brand icon. The man who'd built a restaurant that critics said transcended his southern roots. He was plating a citrus-glazed trout behind a spotless glass partition, completely unaware, or pretending to be, that the woman who'd once braided his hair and walked miles to his middle school parent-teacher nights was just 50 feet away. That same woman who hand-packed his lunches when there wasn't enough money for cafeteria food. That same woman whose name wasn't on the menu, but without whom the restaurant wouldn't exist. And in the shadows outside, in the air heavy with street heat and blooming azaleas, Shaquille O'Neal saw everything. From his car across the street, he didn't move. He just watched. His gaze wasn't filled with fury. It was colder than that, calculating, waited. His driver had the engine running, but Shaq raised a hand without looking up, signaling to wait. His eyes followed Evelyn as she stepped away from the door and walked to the nearest bus bench. Not once did she look back. Not once did she flinch. The bench was metal, rusted along the edges. She lowered herself onto it slowly, with the practiced grace of someone used to waiting in places not meant for her. Around her, the world continued. Patrons filed into the restaurant in crisp suits and floral blouses, talking about business deals and upcoming weddings. No one noticed the woman sitting just yards away, her purse still clutched to her chest like a last word never spoken. Inside the restaurant, the staff reset tables. Champagne bottles were chilled. A server rehearsed the wine list aloud, emphasizing the French names he'd learned only last week. The front door swung open again and again, letting in laughter, letting out air-conditioned silence. But none of it touched Evelyn. And Shaq kept watching. He wasn't just watching what happened, he was seeing why. The ease with which Chelsea dismissed Evelyn wasn't just a bad day or poor training. It was systemic, curated, and unconscious. It was the comfortable rhythm of gatekeeping dressed up in politeness, the learned behavior of a staff trained to recognize the right kind of guest. Evelyn wasn't it. And because she didn't push back, because she didn't cause a scene, they'd forget her before dessert was served. But Shaq wouldn't forget. That was the difference. The injustice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It lived in tone, posture, timing. It lived in the way Chelsea didn't even ask who Evelyn was before deciding she wasn't worth the effort. It lived in the way the staff laughed after she left, brushing her presence off like lint on an Armani sleeve. It lived in how Darren kept his back turned the entire time, how he never came out, even when a message could have been sent to the kitchen. Shaq leaned back in his seat, his shoulders, broad and quiet, pressed against the leather. He looked up at the restaurant's sign, Maddox and Pine, then back at Evelyn. She didn't look upset. She looked used to it. And that more than anything settled something in Shaq's chest. Evelyn Maddox had been denied more than just a table. She'd been denied recognition. Not as a celebrity's mother, not as a public figure, but as a woman who raised a child, gave him everything she had, and then watched him build a palace that didn't have a single room for her. Shaq's jaw clenched, not in anger, but resolve. He'd seen racism take different shapes all his life, in locker rooms, board meetings, and media rooms. But this was personal. Not because Evelyn was anyone important to him, but because she should have been important to someone inside that building. And now she wasn't. Now she was just another black woman told to come back later. Another mother no one wanted to see. But Shaq saw her. And that changed everything. Justice doesn't always knock. Sometimes it walks through the front door unannounced. The heat outside had mellowed, but inside Maddox and Pine, something colder was starting to take hold. Not in temperature, but in tone. The kind of cold that seeps in without a sound, settling beneath the skin of a space, making people uneasy before they know why. Staff still moved through the aisles, clearing dishes and checking wine levels, but their chatter had softened. The hush wasn't spoken, but it spread from table to table, server to server, like smoke through velvet. Shaq's meeting in the manager's office had ended only 10 minutes ago, but the ripples were already pushing outward. Inside that small room, behind a locked door and tight walls, Shaq had made 3 calls. The first wasn't to the restaurant owner, because he was the owner. Not in name on the door, not in promotional campaigns, but on paper where it counted. The restaurant's majority shareholder, silent and overlooked, just the way he wanted it. Until now. The second call was to his legal team. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. They knew when Shaq's tone dropped 2 octaves and lost its usual warmth. The order wasn't to be questioned. He instructed them to draw up immediate termination notices for the entire front-of-house team, effective by sundown. That included Chelsea, Jesse, the manager, every server who'd smirked while Evelyn walked out the door. The third call was to his media advisor, not for spin but for silence. "We go dark," he said. "Let the rumors grow. Don't feed them." The message was simple. They weren't preparing a statement. They were preparing a reckoning. Downstairs, Darren still hadn't been told. He was busy plating dessert samplers for a couple celebrating their anniversary, oblivious to the shift in the air. The sous chefs had noticed it, though. The line cooks, too. Even the dishwashers could feel something humming beneath the surface. Kyle, the general manager, returned from the meeting with Shaq, looking pale and distracted, suddenly unsure where to focus. He pulled Chelsea aside near the staff sink. "You might want to step into the office," he said, voice low and clipped. "Why?" she asked, mid-text. "Now." She scoffed, but followed. Back at the host stand, a hostess who hadn't been present during Evelyn's incident whispered to the bartender, "Why are we clearing our lockers?" "No idea," he muttered. "But Shaq's been here. Something's up." Minutes later, 3 servers were asked to clock out. No explanation, no smiles, no thank yous. Just a short walk to the back, a silence, and a printed form. By 1:45 p.m., 5 staff members had left the building, coats in hand, name tags still pinned. The kitchen felt it next. Orders began slowing, then halting. The printer that usually spat out meal tickets every few seconds sat quiet. Darren, confused, pushed open the double doors to the dining room and scanned the floor. It looked fine, but it didn't feel fine. He approached Kyle at the bar. "Where's the lunch crowd?" Kyle hesitated. "Some cancellations." "Since when?" "Since about 20 minutes ago." Darren narrowed his eyes. "Did something happen?" Kyle didn't answer. Then came the call. Shaq's team had just confirmed the paperwork. As of that moment, Maddox and Pine was officially shuttered pending internal restructuring due to systemic cultural failure. That phrase, dry and corporate, would never make it into a headline. But to anyone who understood, it meant rot had been found at the core. Not a scandal, not a fluke, a pattern. Darren's phone buzzed with a single notification from the internal investor portal. Temporary suspension of operations. Effective immediately. His throat went dry. He turned toward the window and watched as a third hostess exited the building with her coat draped over one arm, her face tight with confusion. He stormed back to the kitchen. Why the hell are people leaving? What's going on? No one answered, not because they didn't know, but because the truth was too big to say out loud. Meanwhile, across the street, Evelyn still sat. She hadn't moved much. Her feet remained flat on the ground, knees together, purse in her lap, but her expression had changed. Slightly. There was still calm in her face, but it had softened, as if a weight had shifted, if only a little. A boy, no older than 7, with deep brown skin and a head full of tight curls, walked up to her. He wore a red t-shirt 2 sizes too big and held a flower in his tiny hands, a purple wildflower pulled from the crack between sidewalk slabs. He didn't say a word, just offered it. Evelyn looked down at it, then up at the boy. Her smile didn't spread fast. It unfolded slow, uncertain, but real. She took the flower, whispered something we couldn't hear, and the boy ran back to his mother. In that moment, Evelyn still didn't know what Shaq had done. She didn't know about the terminations, or the sudden lockdown of operations, or the growing panic in the investor thread now filling Darren's inbox. She didn't know that media outlets had already begun sniffing around the restaurant, asking vague questions about a high-profile investor shaking up management. She didn't know about the chef who was pacing behind locked doors, demanding answers, trying to call Shaq directly, and being met with quiet, deliberate silence. But she didn't need to know, because something deeper had already shifted, not just in business, but in balance. Justice hadn't announced itself with lawyers or protests or hashtags. It had walked in, made its calls, and walked out, unseen by most, but felt by all. And it wasn't finished. Not yet. No amount of fame can quiet the voice that knows who you really are. Long before Maddox and Pine shimmered on magazine covers and dominated influencer maps, Darren Maddox was just another boy learning how to stretch peanut butter over stale bread so it covered both ends. He grew up counting streetlights on the walk home, memorizing which ones worked and which corners to avoid. Their apartment always smelled like something cooking, not because they had plenty, but because Evelyn knew how to make little taste like luxury. Fried cabbage, buttered rice, eggs in 6 ways. She fed Darren with food and faith, and he learned to survive on both. But hunger leaves fingerprints. Not the kind you see, but the kind you feel when you step into a room that wasn't built for people like you. It leaves a sound in your ears, the whisper of don't belong, and Darren carried that sound with him when he got his first scholarship to culinary school in New York. It should have been a dream, and maybe it was for a minute, until he unpacked his things and noticed the silence when he walked into his first classroom. He was the only black student in the room. He wasn't unfamiliar with being the only one, but now he was surrounded by last names that came with legacy, whose families dined at restaurants Darren could never afford, whose summers were spent abroad studying cheese aging in the French countryside while Evelyn was working overtime shifts to keep his meal card loaded. He smiled anyway. He laughed when they called his mother's cornbread charming. He swallowed pride like broken glass. He told himself it was just the price of elevation. Then came his first stage, a training internship at a 5-star restaurant in Tribeca. He wore a lone jacket 2 sizes too big, and cooked his heart out while the head chef ignored him for the first month. It wasn't until Darren recreated a poached halibut with saffron cream that he was finally noticed. Not complimented, just noticed. A nod, a grunt, permission to keep existing in the room. That nod changed something in him. It became currency. He began learning the codes, how to soften his voice, how to neutralize his accent, how to nod along when black food was called street and French food was called elevated. He stopped correcting people when they assumed he was from a private school in DC. He started using Southern classic instead of black staple. When someone joked that he should teach a class on soul food without the soul, Darren laughed harder than he should have. Back home, Evelyn still mailed him handwritten recipes, clippings from newspapers, notes about how proud she was. He rarely replied. Sometimes the shame was too sharp. Other times, it was just inconvenient. He was reinventing himself, and Evelyn didn't fit the rebrand. His first real money came from a small catering deal for a high-profile art event. $8,000 for one night of fusion bites and Southern-style sliders. He sent her $200 and called it a blessing. He never mentioned her name when the write-up ran in the New York Times. Instead, he credited mentors, hustle, and vision. When he opened his first pop-up in Atlanta, he told Evelyn, but didn't invite her to the soft launch. Too busy, he said, not ready for press. She watched him on TV from her apartment couch and whispered, "That's my boy," to the empty room. And then came Maddox and Pine, a name he chose, ironically, to seem more rustic. The Maddox was real, but the Pine was fake. There was no tree in the family, no lineage behind the word, just a safe, earthy noun that made the restaurant sound like old money and Oakwood elegance. Investors lined up. His face went national. He was called the new standard. Refined soul, one critic wrote. Grace without grit. But Darren always knew what he'd buried to get there. Every menu that omitted oxtail. Every brunch that served chicken but not fried. Every kitchen meeting where he nodded when someone said, "Let's not go too ethnic." Every glance he turned away from when someone mispronounced a black staffer's name. And Evelyn? She was the hardest truth of all. A reminder of what he owed but hadn't paid. She was the scent of hot grease and dignity, the kind that didn't photograph well. She was the version of himself he'd traded for a seat at someone else's table. Now all of that shame had a spotlight, and not just any spotlight, Shaquille O'Neal's. Shaq didn't air his grievances with drama. He let receipts speak, the lease documents, the investor statements, the silence after the press conference. Shaq wasn't trying to ruin Darren. He was unmasking him, forcing him to look in the mirror after years of dodging it. And Darren did look. At first, quietly. He turned off his phone, closed the blinds in his penthouse, sat in the silence, and stared at his reflection in the black screen of his TV. Not the glossy version from magazine shoots, but the unfiltered one. Tired eyes, gritted jaw, pride disguising regret. The mirror doesn't lie. It didn't lie when he remembered Evelyn's hands packing his suitcase for college. It didn't lie when he ignored her call after the restaurant opened. It didn't lie when he recognized her that day and still said nothing. It didn't lie when her name came up in the staff group chat as that confused lady. It didn't lie when he turned his back. And now the world had turned its back on him. Sponsorship deals paused. His PR firm dropped him with a boilerplate no longer a client statement. A celebrity chef who once praised his innovation now posted cryptically about authenticity over access. Food blogs changed their tone, reframing his success as a product of aesthetic conformity rather than culinary genius. But none of that stung like the fact that Evelyn still hadn't spoken to him. Not on the phone, not through anyone else, not even through the media who begged for her side. She didn't grant a single interview, didn't write a statement, didn't tweet, because her silence said what words couldn't. You already knew, and you let it happen. In the quiet, Darren returned to the old apartment. Boarded up now. The street nearly unrecognizable from when he was a kid. He stood across from it and stared, hoping some part of it would open up and tell him what to do next. But ghosts don't offer directions. He sat on the same bench where Evelyn had once waited after being thrown out of his restaurant. He imagined what it felt like. The concrete under her. The traffic noise. The rejection. No cameras. No followers. No chef's coat. Just a mother, unseen. And a son, too late. Sometimes it takes a mother to heal what a son destroyed. It arrived on a Sunday. Folded neatly between ads for discounted mattresses and coupons for grocery stores, no longer owned by the communities they served. The letter was printed on page 6 of the Atlanta Metro Gazette. No headline, no photo, just a letter, surrounded by empty white space, like a voice finally being given room to echo. At first, most people flipped past it, then someone read it, then someone reposted it, then someone filmed themselves reading it aloud, crying through the last paragraph. Within 12 hours, it was on every timeline, every thread, every newsfeed. Lucille O'Neill, a woman who had watched the world call her son Superman, while knowing he was first just a boy she held through nights of fever and fear, had written to another mother, not as a celebrity, not as a brand ambassador, but as a woman who knew what it meant to raise a black son in a country that teaches them to run toward success and away from themselves. The letter wasn't long. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Dear Evelyn, I don't know you in person, but I know you in spirit. I know your hands. I know the ache in your back after carrying more than you were ever meant to. I know what it's like to iron shirts before dawn, to tape together lunch bags when you run out, to feed a boy with all your hope while swallowing your own disappointment. I know the sound of your knees on a church floor when you're praying for rent, not revival. I know the silence of a phone that doesn't ring on your birthday. I know the way the world rewards our sons when they forget us, when they cut their hair, soften their tone, and lose their history to gain their stage. And I know that we, as mothers, don't ask for credit, but we deserve to be seen. You raised a king, Evelyn. But kings forget their crowns are held up by women who never stopped bowing their heads in prayer. You were the root beneath a table he tried to polish clean of dirt, but the dirt is where the life is. I'm sorry for what they did to you. Not just that day, but every day your silence went unrecognized as grace. I'm sorry he didn't look you in the eyes. You are not forgotten. You are the standard. You are the story. With love and honor, Lucille O'Neill. That was all. No speech, no press tour, no TV interview. Just a letter. But it cut through the noise like thunder across still water. The response was immediate and unstoppable. Black mothers across the country reposted the letter with their own captions. This is me, my mother too. I felt every word. White allies shared it as a reckoning, realizing for the first time that ambition often tramples the very hands that built it. Educators printed it out and pinned it on classroom walls. Churches read it aloud from pulpits. Spoken word artists turned it into monologues on open mics across cities. The letter didn't just change the conversation, it reframed the lens. Suddenly, Evelyn Maddox wasn't just a woman dismissed from a restaurant. She was the mother the nation had overlooked, the embodiment of dignity that didn't scream, didn't tweet, didn't retaliate, but endured. The public began demanding more than apologies. They demanded systems, recognition, respect. The restaurant was no longer the center of the scandal. Evelyn was the center of a movement. And still, she hadn't said a word. In her apartment, she sat at the kitchen table with a printout of the letter, reading it slowly with her glasses slightly tilted, her thumb brushing the edge of the paper like it was something sacred. She didn't cry, but her chest rose and fell in a new rhythm. Not relief exactly, but recognition. Lucille hadn't just spoken to her. She'd seen her. Shaq watched from afar, but not passively. He was still in Atlanta, working behind the scenes to reroute the restaurant property into a foundation, the Evelyn Trust, meant to fund young black chefs, especially those whose dreams didn't come with family inheritances or legacy connections. He didn't make a show of it. His name wasn't on the front, but his fingerprints were everywhere. Lucille had written the letter without telling him. He found out the same way the rest of the world did, through the paper. When he called her later, all she said was, "She reminded me of myself, and of who you might have become, if you hadn't remembered me." Shaq didn't argue. He just whispered, "Thank you," and hung up. Meanwhile, Darren sat alone in a small rental house, far from his penthouse, staring at the letter on a laptop screen that felt like it was glowing with indictment. He had read it a dozen times, each line pulling him deeper into the realization that this wasn't just about Evelyn. This was about what he had allowed himself to become. A man who had traded the truth for texture. a chef who'd burned the bridge that led him to the kitchen. He sent Shaq a message that afternoon. Not to fight, not to ask for favors, but to ask for a copy of the original lease agreement Evelyn had signed. I never actually looked at it, he admitted. I need to. Shaq sent it, along with a post-it note that read, "She didn't need your permission, she just gave you the opportunity." And in that moment, Darren understood what Evelyn had always tried to give him. Not just a path, but a place where he could belong without having to abandon himself. That night, Lucille's letter was projected onto the side of a building in downtown Atlanta, as part of an art installation. Evelyn didn't attend. She stayed home and watched the news coverage from her couch. The anchor read her name aloud with reverence. The camera cut to young women holding candles. A child held a handmade sign. "My mom is a queen too." The story had changed. And it hadn't changed because of lawsuits or PR pressure. It changed because one mother spoke to another. Not for attention, but for truth. The ovens were off, but the world outside was burning. The building sat like a ghost on Auburn Avenue, a shell wrapped in silence, its polished nameplate tarnished by truth. The white awnings had been removed. The gold-lettered windows, once reflecting the luxury brunch crowd, were now covered in brown construction paper. Behind them, nothing moved. No clatter of pans, no jazz, no rhythm of knives dicing onions with precision. Maddox and Pine was no longer a restaurant, it was a monument, and the kitchen stayed cold. Shaquille O'Neal had finalized the purchase quietly. No press conference, no ribbon-cutting ceremony. Just paperwork handled between two law firms, then transferred into a land trust under Evelyn Maddox's name. It was official. Darren no longer owned a single brick of what had once been his pride. The restaurant that had stood as a symbol of his curated identity now belonged fully and legally to the very woman he had erased from it. But outside, the streets were louder than ever. Each day, people gathered at the intersection just beyond the entrance. Not in chaos, but in unity. Protest signs mixed with candles. Placards read, "Respect Black mothers. Legacy isn't whitewashed, and you don't get to edit us out." Painters and poets brought folding chairs and created as the crowd watched. One woman braided hair for free under a red umbrella, while a saxophonist played old spirituals beside a mural in progress. The mural grew over 2 weekends. First a sketch, then slow layers of color, and by the third Sunday, Evelyn's face looked out over the street. Strong, still, painted with earth tones and rising behind her, instead of flames, a garden. From silence, something had bloomed. Darren had not returned to the site. His name was still being scrubbed from his own menus across the country. Partners who once lined up to license his signature sauces now distanced themselves. A cookware company canceled their upcoming collaboration, releasing a statement about internal integrity values. A cooking competition show replaced him with a new judge mid-season and edited the first 2 episodes to reduce his screen time. His agent stopped answering calls. Other celebrity chefs, many of them black, some of them white, began speaking out. Not with outrage, but with clarity. One posted, "You don't get to wear culture like seasoning. It's not a garnish, it's a root." Another said, "If your rise demands erasing the ones who lifted you, you're not a chef, you're a thief." But despite the fire outside, inside the building, everything was still. The tables remained covered, the stoves untouched, no prep lists, no aroma of thyme or roasted garlic, no laminated service schedules. The walk-in fridge had been emptied, the kitchen lights turned off at the breaker. The message was clear. Healing didn't happen over a soft relaunch or rebranding campaign. It happened in the pause, and through it all, Evelyn had said nothing. No interviews, no statements, no photos with fans, no exclusive deals or book offers. Her silence wasn't strategic, it was sacred, the kind of silence earned through decades of knowing that loud doesn't always mean strong. She let the world talk while she tended to her own peace, quietly, at home, still caring for her neighbors' plants when they traveled, still sending birthday cards to the children of friends she hadn't seen in years. She did, however, receive a letter. It came in a manila envelope, no return address. Just her name, handwritten in tight, careful script. She knew the penmanship. She had helped teach it. She took it to the kitchen table and opened it without ceremony. Inside was a single folded page. On it, her son's handwriting. No greetings, no excuses, just confession. "Mama, I knew it was you. That day. From the moment you walked in, I saw you before the hostess did. I was in the kitchen. I saw you through the pass. I told myself you wouldn't want the attention, that you'd understand, that I was too busy. But none of that was true. The truth is, I didn't stop them, because I didn't want to be reminded of who I was before the cameras, before the menu, before the world clapped for me. I stood there, and I watched them push you out. I let it happen. There's no fixing that, but I needed to say it to you. Not for a headline, not for redemption, just because I couldn't carry the lie anymore. You were always the only real thing about my story. I'm sorry. Darren. Evelyn folded the letter and placed it inside her Bible, between Psalms and Proverbs, and didn't speak a word of it to anyone. That was the twist, not in scandal, but in truth. Darren's fall hadn't come from tweets or sponsors pulling out. It had come from a single line on a lease, a mother's mural, and now, a quiet letter no one else would ever read. The kitchen at Maddox and Pine remained dark, but on its outer wall, Evelyn's painted gaze watched the city evolve. Not in anger, but in witness. And from that stillness, something new waited to rise. Forgiveness is not weakness, it's choosing to walk forward when you could burn everything down. It wasn't a televised event. No networks were invited, no podiums were set, no national banners stretched across the walls. Just a modest community center on the west side of Atlanta. Red bricks faded from years of summer heat and rainy winters, a leaky roof patched by donations and volunteers, and folding chairs arranged in uneven rows beneath flickering lights. A space where people gathered not for show, but for soul. The flyer was handwritten, taped to corner store windows and bus stop poles. Community Healing Night, Guest Reflection, by Evelyn Maddox. No dramatic announcement, no hashtags. But word spread, not through headlines, but through people. Through the barbershop owner who said, "That's the woman from the mural." Through the Sunday school teacher who remembered Evelyn's homemade pound cake. Through neighbors who once borrowed sugar and never forgot her kindness. By the time the chairs were filled, people were standing in the back, leaning against walls, sitting on the floor near the stage. Teenagers, elders, mothers holding toddlers. A few reporters had come, but none dared bring cameras. Something in the air told them this wasn't theirs to record. The room was quiet when Evelyn walked in. She wore a navy blue dress, simple, pressed, the same one she'd worn to church the day Darren graduated culinary school. Her hair was tied back, no makeup, no jewelry, just her presence, dignified, deliberate. She walked slowly down the center aisle and up onto the small platform, where a wooden mic stand waited beside a potted plant and a pitcher of water. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't smile for effect. She just began. "I've been quiet most of my life," she said, voice steady, "because being black and loud don't go together in this country, not without consequences. I learned young that silence can be safer than speaking." The audience leaned in. A baby fussed briefly, then quieted. Evelyn glanced at no one and everyone. "I raised my son to be proud of who he was, not because I thought the world would reward him for it, but because I didn't want the world to convince him he was less than." She paused, but I also knew the world had a way of lying real pretty. The words hit the air like bricks laid gently. "I scrubbed floors so he could study. I skipped meals so he could eat. I took night shifts so he could sleep peacefully. I didn't do it for gratitude. I did it because that's what love looks like when you're a black mother and the world ain't offering you nothing free." A murmur of agreement moved through the room, soft nods, quiet hums. "I watched my son rise," she said, "and I cheered for him, even when he forgot who was clapping." Her voice didn't crack, she didn't raise it. "He turned away from me," she continued. "Not all at once, but in steps, like trimming a tree branch by branch until the root's still there, but nothing familiar's left on the surface." Somewhere near the back, a teenage girl wiped her eyes. Beside her, a grandmother pressed a tissue into her palm, without saying a word. "When I walked into that restaurant," Evelyn said, "I wasn't trying to shame him. I wasn't there to ask for anything. I just wanted to see how far he'd come, and I found out how far I'd been left behind." She let the silence sit, let it settle. "I could have screamed. I could have gone to the papers. I could have let my anger write the next chapter. Lord knows I had enough reason." She exhaled. Not from fatigue, from release. "But I chose something else." She looked out at them now, slow and sure. "I chose to remember that I am not made of what people forget. I am not made less because someone decided my presence was inconvenient." A few claps, quiet but firm, followed. "Forgiveness," she said, "is not for him." She touched her chest. "It's for me, so I don't carry the poison in my bones, so I don't shrink into bitterness and forget that I was whole before the world tried to break me down." People nodded. She stepped closer to the edge of the platform, her voice warming. "I'm not excusing what my son did. Let me be clear, accountability still matters. If a tree grows crooked, the gardener should know when and why, but I will not let his blindness steal my vision. My son lost his way, but I refuse to lose mine." That line hung in the air. For a moment, it was the only sound in the room. And then came the rise. Not applause at first. A few people stood, then more, until nearly everyone was on their feet, not cheering but witnessing a collective rising, not in celebration but in reverence. Evelyn didn't cry. She didn't soak it in like a victory. She simply nodded, thanked them softly, and stepped down. Outside the community center, the night air was cool. People stood in clusters, some still wiping their faces, others just holding the moment in their chests. No one reached for phones. No one asked for selfies. They understood what they'd just received. Not performance, not a statement, but truth in its rawest, most graceful form. Evelyn left through the side exit, walking home alone, the same way she had walked through years of struggle, unannounced, undeterred. A block away, across the street from the mural bearing her image, Darren sat in his car, unseen. He'd heard about the gathering but knew better than to walk in. Not yet, maybe not ever. He didn't deserve to sit among them. Not tonight. But he listened through the cracked window. He heard every word. And something in him broke. Not from shame that had already come, but from clarity. He hadn't just failed Evelyn. He'd failed what she stood for. That night, as people carried Evelyn's words into their homes, into their conversations, into their children's ears, something changed. Not in headlines, not in ownership, but in the understanding of legacy. Because forgiveness isn't letting someone off the hook. It's saying, I'm not dragging this chain behind me anymore. And in that letting go, Evelyn became something far greater than the woman who was once turned away. She became the woman who could have burned the building down, but chose instead to light a lantern, so others could find their way home. If the table isn't built for everyone, flip it and build a new one. The old sign came down without ceremony. No press, no publicist, no statement. Just a plain utility van, parked outside the building. One humid morning, a two-man crew climbing ladders and loosening bolts from rusted brackets. The letters that once spelled Maddox and Pine were removed in silence, one by one, until the white stucco wall stood bare, unbranded. The name had carried weight for years, on menus, on awards, on the lips of critics, but now its removal felt like exhaling something toxic. By the end of the day, a new sign was mounted. No gold, no marble, just a warm wooden slab carved with 3 words: Lucille's Table. It didn't come with a logo or a slogan, but for those who knew the names, Lucille O'Neill, who raised a giant with grace, and Evelyn Maddox, who held the world together without asking for thanks, the message was enough. This wasn't a restaurant, it was a reset. Shaq hadn't built it to be flashy. He didn't want it to become trendy. There were no white tablecloths, no molecular gastronomy, no overpriced wine pairings. Lucille's Table was a training ground, a sanctuary, a space for transformation, built for the community that was always good enough to serve food but rarely invited to own the kitchen. The floors were redone with reclaimed wood from torn-down houses in the old Fourth Ward. The walls were painted deep emerald green, lined with framed portraits of black mothers, not celebrities, but real women submitted by their families, grandmothers, aunts, godmothers, foster moms. Each photo had a brass plate beneath it with one sentence: she never left the table. Shaq worked quietly through it all. He oversaw the remodel personally, consulting with contractors between school visits and hospital check-ins. There were no corporate partners, no angel investors. Every dollar came from Shaq's own pocket, and he refused to accept donations. This ain't charity, he told one business associate. This is accountability. In the back of the space, where the chef's office used to be, a new classroom was built. It had a prep kitchen, a long table, and a whiteboard that read, "Welcome to Legacy Line, where we train not just cooks but creators." Each week, 10 young black men and women, some fresh out of high school, others recently incarcerated, others just looking for purpose, would come through those doors and learn, not just how to cook, but how to own, how to lead, how to build something that couldn't be taken from them. And there were rules. No ego. No yelling. No kitchen hierarchy built on fear. Respect was the only uniform. Word spread. Not through glossy magazine features, but through barbershops, laundromats, teachers, cousins, probation officers. You heard about Lucille's Table the way you heard about the best place to get your car fixed, by someone who'd been there and left better. Opening day arrived quietly. No velvet ropes. No step and repeat banners. Just a line of people outside. By 10 a.m., elders, students, children, families. They didn't come for buzz. They came for belonging. Inside, the staff stood in a half-circle behind the pass. All new faces, all black. Most had never worked in fine dining. They were nervous, proud, trembling a little, but ready. At 11 a.m., the doors opened. Shaq didn't greet people at the front. He stayed in the back, in his gray tee and apron, helping a young trainee plate cornbread biscuits. But when she walked in, Evelyn Maddox, the room changed. No one announced her. No spotlight swung her way, but people saw her. And they stood. Every table, every chair, every guest. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't requested. They just rose. Not for what she'd suffered. Not for what she'd survived. But for what she'd built, even when the world told her she hadn't built anything at all. Evelyn didn't wave. She didn't curtsy. She just smiled, nodded once, and let a single tear roll down her cheek before she took her seat at a small table near the front window, the one with the best view of the mural outside. Her mural. Shaq stepped out from the kitchen eventually, wiping his hands on a towel, no microphone, no speech, and sat across from her. They didn't speak at first. They didn't need to. The table spoke for them. And finally, after everything, after betrayal, and silence, and rage, and reckoning, there was food. Real food. Made with hands that had once been doubted. Served by people who once didn't see a place for themselves in rooms like these. And in the middle of it all, Evelyn lifted her fork, not as a guest, not as a mother, but as the reason this table ever existed. She never asked for a seat. She was the reason the table existed in the first place. The late sun glinted off the windows of Lucille's table, casting warm amber light across the sidewalk where people still lingered hours after the grand opening. The kitchen was closed now, the chairs stacked, the prep surfaces cleaned and scrubbed. But no one wanted to leave, not because of the food, though it had been good, soulful, full of rosemary and honey and home, but because something sacred had happened between those walls, something they didn't want to step away from too quickly. Inside, the lights had dimmed, leaving only the soft glow of the mural's reflection through the window and a few pendant bulbs hanging above the main dining floor. The space had emptied except for two people who remained at the center of the room. Evelyn Maddox, seated in the same chair she'd claimed at the start of the day, and Shaquille O'Neal standing beside her with arms folded, watching her with the quiet calm of someone who no longer needed to say anything. He hadn't made a speech that day, hadn't stood up to be thanked or applauded. He simply showed up, stood back and let the truth take its place. And now, as the night deepened outside, he pulled out a final envelope, simple, white, sealed in wax, and laid it gently on the table in front of Evelyn. She looked up. "What's this?" He nodded at it. "Your seat, official, permanent, and not just here." Inside was a document, notarized, bound, and plain. Evelyn Maddox, Chairwoman Emeritus, the Maddox O'Neal Culinary Collective. Her name was now on every deed, every partnership, every future project tied to the legacy Shaq was building. Not as a figurehead, not as a gesture, but as foundation. She blinked slowly, her fingers trembling over the edge of the paper. "You didn't have to." Shaq shook his head once. "No, but it should have been done a long time ago." Outside, across the street, and tucked behind a dark sedan parked beneath a flickering street lamp, a man stood alone. His hood was up, hands buried in his pockets. He didn't get out, didn't make himself known. He didn't even move when the door of Lucille's table opened again, and more people spilled out, laughing, lingering, stretching the moment before the night swallowed it whole. Darren Maddox didn't belong inside that space anymore. He knew that. He didn't come to speak or explain or ask for forgiveness. He came for something much quieter, to witness the life his mother had been denied, and now finally received. He watched as Evelyn stood up slowly, folded the document with reverence, and placed it gently in her purse like it was something holy. He watched her embrace a young girl who ran up and said, "You look just like my Nana." He watched Shaq help an older couple to their car, laughing low, not towering above but walking beside them. He saw the space his absence had created, and how it had been filled not with spite, but with something deeper. Dignity. And community. Evelyn hadn't burned the place down. She had turned it into something larger than him. She didn't take back her seat by force. She didn't scream for attention. She simply endured, until the table was reset to what it should have been all along. A place she never had to earn. Shaq walked her out a little after midnight. The sidewalk was nearly empty now. A street sweeper rumbled by. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistled low. Evelyn moved slowly, her purse in one hand, the other resting lightly on Shaq's arm. "You tired?" he asked. "No more than usual," she smiled. He chuckled, then turned toward the mural across the street. "That don't look tired." Evelyn followed his gaze. There she was, her painted self, eyes full of depth, skin aglow in dusk tones, standing behind a field of collards and lilies. Around her, a quote in gold script. She planted more than food. She planted us. It hadn't been her idea. The community came up with it, but it felt right. Shaq pulled out a single key from his pocket, bronze, smooth-edged, and placed it in her hand. You ever want to open up early, he said, or just sit alone before the doors unlock? That key works every door in this place. Evelyn held it tightly. He turned to go, but she reached for his wrist gently. You didn't have to do all this, she whispered. Shaq met her eyes. You didn't have to raise him, but you did. She nodded. They said nothing else. Shaq walked away. And Evelyn stood for a moment longer, alone now beneath the mural, staring not at her face, but at the field around it. The garden had grown. Across the street, Darren finally turned, walking away slowly, head down, steps quiet. He didn't go to the car. He kept walking past the mural, past the block, deeper into the city that had once crowned him king and now asked for better. He had no crown now, but he had the letter she'd never answered, and maybe that was enough. The next day, a new headline appeared online. Lucille's Table announces community brunch program for single mothers, $1 meals, no questions asked. Evelyn saw it over coffee. She smiled. Then she opened the front door and stepped into the morning light. She didn't just have a seat now. She had a legacy. And finally, it had her name on it. Some stories aren't just meant to be watched. They're meant to be remembered, questioned, and passed on. If this moved you, ask yourself who's been left out of your table and what it'll take to build a new one. The next chapter of change doesn't start on a screen. It starts with you.